Listen, I'm sure those guys will be fine. Eventually. Hello, Internet. I'm Ren, and today I want to talk about Atomic Blonde, a 2017 film written by Kurt Johnstad and directed by David Leitch. This video will also feature some insights from my friend Andy Villin, who is also doing a review of Atomic Blonde for his series Cinema of the Rainbow. You should definitely check out his video as well. Touted as a female Bond movie, Atomic Blonde is a lot of fun, with intense and creatively choreographed combat scenes, a delightful, if predictable, soundtrack, and a slick period aesthetic that brings 1989 Berlin to life. Theron plays Lorraine Broughton, an elite MI6 agent and the titular Atomic Blonde, a badass bisexual spy with an iconic platinum bob who brawls her way through Berlin in an attempt to find and extricate a missing list containing the identities of all the active operatives in the city, before it gets into the hands of the KGB. Atomic Blonde was actually a passion project for Charlize Theron after she read an advanced copy of The Coldest City, the graphic novel from which the film is adapted. She co-produced the film through her production company Denver and Delilah Productions. It was also Theron who sought out Leitch to direct after his work on John Wick.
David just came in with such a visual and such an idea of what he wanted the heart of this film to be. It was brave, it was refreshing, it was provocative. I knew he was the person that I wanted to make this movie with, no matter what.
Atomic Blonde is his first feature film as principal director.
I wanted to spin the spy genre on its head, try something fresh.
It's always a good time when Charlize Theron plays a seemingly unkillable bisexual action hero in a film based on a graphic novel. And it was fun to see her do it again in The Old Guard in 2020 as Andromache of Scythia, a member of an immortal band of fighters who rise from the dead when they're killed. Both The Old Guard and Atomic Blonde have sequels due out sometime in the near future, and I'm so excited to see the continuation of both of these stories. The bisexual element of Atomic Blonde isn't present in the graphic novel and was a change suggested by Johnstad as a way to differentiate Atomic Blonde from other action films. One of many ways it improved upon its source material, though not all the choices made in adaptation were good ones. But we'll get there. As someone whose mother is from Germany and who has both East and West German family, the Cold War has always fascinated me. There are so many little cultural impacts that still linger from its influence today. For example, older West Germans are fairly likely to speak at least some English, but my older relatives from the East are more likely to know a little Russian. I think the film does a good job highlighting Berlin in particular as a microcosm of the contrast between the East and the West, including the desperation of people in the East to flee to the more favorable social and economic conditions of the West. West Berlin was sort of an island of primarily American and British control behind the Iron Curtain, creating an unusual political climate in the city that the film uses to its advantage. This section will have some minor spoilers for the overall story, but I will give you a warning before I go ahead and spoil all the big things like major character deaths or the ending. Atomic Blonde begins with the murder of MI6 agent James Gascoigne by a KGB operative, Bacton.
I always thought if I got tagged it would be by the best. But you're not the best, are you, Bacton?
Who takes the list in the form of a wristwatch from Gascoigne's body before tossing him into the Spree River. We flash forward to 10 days later when we're introduced to Lorraine as she submerges her bruised body in an ice bath. When she gets out, we see she's covered in some tremendous contusions. She then burns a photo of her and Gascoigne, which of course implies a connection. And then she gets dressed and heads into the office where she's questioned by MI6 and the CIA about what exactly happened in Berlin, which serves as a framing device throughout the film. The CIA agent is, of course, played by John Goodman. It's a small role, but he's a lot of fun in it.
Berlin. What happened?
I also just love this moment.
Berlin.
Fuck. Great summary. We then return to the beginning, when Lorraine is first assigned to Berlin, and filled in on what happened to Gascoigne.
Gascoigne was killed last night on a mission in Berlin.
Her superiors instruct her to retrieve the list, and
Trust no one.
She's to meet up with David Percival, played by James McAvoy, another MI6 agent that her superiors warn her has
Gone somewhat native.
I'm fucking feral.
during his extended assignment in Berlin. I love Percival. He's incredibly fun to watch. When we're first introduced to him, he's trading information and smuggled goods with a bunch of East Berlin punks, and McAvoy is clearly having the time of his life.
Straight from the tip of the Virgin Mary.
We're also introduced to Spyglass, a Stasi officer who created the list and gave it to Gascoigne in exchange for getting his family out of Berlin. But Percival, who of course does not have the list, tells him no list, no deal.
I risked everything.
But Spyglass insists he's memorized it.
Tell me you made a copy. I memorized it. Memorized it?
Lorraine arrives in West Berlin, and from the moment she steps out of the airport, the KGB appears to know who she is and why she's there.
Miss Broughton, you must try the Central Cafe for a drink.
Initially tricking her into getting into one of their cars,
You remember Mr. Bremovich, don't you? Of course you do.
and leading to this incredible scene where she stabs a dude over and over with her stiletto to escape.
Well, he's very curious what you're doing here in Berlin.
And someone else is also watching her from the sidelines. She's immediately distrustful of Percival,
5 minutes on the ground and I'm already made.
You're not made.
They knew my name.
That's troubling.
and goes about securing her own contacts to help her track down the list, as well as determine the identity of Satchel,
Spyglass revealed that this list would expose a double agent by the name of Satchel.
a double agent MI6 has been pursuing and asked her to look out for.
This traitor's been a thorn in our side for years.
Her primary contact in the East is Merkel, played by Bill Skarsgård. Yes, that's right, it's Pennywise. This movie even came out the same year as It Part 1. Good for him. What follows is a series of fiascos where pretty much everywhere Lorraine goes, she has to fight a bunch of dudes. And it is awesome. The fight scenes in this movie are on another level, with visceral and imaginative choreography most action films can only aspire to. Lorraine gets her ass kicked, again and again. Although, she certainly gives as good as she gets. There's one particularly brutal scene where she faces off with a KGB agent who looks like he's cosplaying Rutger Hauer in Blade Runner, and they both do so much damage that they end up staggering around trying to finish each other off until Lorraine finally ends the fight with a corkscrew. There's a lot of great moments in this movie with found objects during fight scenes, and it gives it such an improvised feel. I am obsessed. And now Andy is going to tell us a little bit more about the action behind the scenes.
Hey y'all, I'm Andy. Thanks so much for having me. Atomic Blonde is such an exciting film that I happen to know both Ren and I have been wanting to talk about for a long time now, so happy to be here. After finding out that this film was helmed by David Leitch, one of the guys behind John Wick and himself an experienced stunt performer and coordinator, you might kind of get a mental glimpse of what the action set pieces of this movie might feel like. And you might be half right.
I got into shooting fight scenes and action sequences and telling those stories.
Yeah.
I started to want to expand.
I do remember when the film first came out, and I didn't watch it initially, but I thought it was a spin-off to the whole John Wick verse, as it later became. And looking at the stunt choreography and the style of it on its own, you might be tempted to think so. But through the amazing physical performances from especially Charlize Theron and the stunt performers basically showing off all the way throughout the film, add that with the kinetic energy of the soundtrack and the style of that. I mean, it gives it that unique flavor to me that really sets it apart. And if you take anything away from this movie, it will be the stylized fun of these amazing action set pieces. And I think in a cinematic landscape where big blockbusters often trade off good, cohesive action with visual noise, let's be real, I think something so banal as treating your environment and your location as an important element in the action is just so nice to see. Like the car escape earlier on in the film, or my personal favorite, the George Michael father figure sequence in the old apartment building. That scene to me is a masterclass in action. Not only are you using this old kitchen and all the kitchen appliances to fend off your enemy, but you have a great rhythm to tie it all together. Not just cutting to the beats and the music. Any old trailer house editor can pull that off, but you actually have a contrast between the heavy action that is so cool and kinetic, but the slow moments, like a western almost stare down as Lorraine reevaluates her options and how she's gonna fend off the attackers next. I love that shit. And I mean, I think too, you had the amazing stairway sequence, which really goes to show, once again, as an audience, why Lorraine is just the best. We are so used to seeing in action movies unbeatable gods just flying through like walls and taking incredible beatings and just walking it off. But here, this movie does have that flavor from time to time too, to be fair. But it's so much more interesting to see a protagonist that actually takes some beatings, is worn down in time, out of breath, actually tired. And there is an incredible small moment of solidarity between two opponents during the scene where they're both down and kind of out of breath and tired, and they take a moment, get slowly back up, and then, okay, now we can go back to ripping each other's heads off. That is so much more interesting from a character perspective, and that's why we're so lucky to have Charlize Theron actually do a lot of her own stunts, because you get the face, you get the performance, you get the drama and the character.
And so as I was training, I would take photos of the actual bruises that I did get, and I would keep, I had like a whole file of all of my real bruises and fighters. And I do think both those characters have come from circumstances where they just will not take no for. They won't be the ones not walking out of the building.
Because, I mean, a romance is one thing, action is another, but action is not lesser in terms of drama. You also need to have that character building in those moments. It's not just wham, pam, pow. You need that.
Because a lot of this film is just being told through the physical.
Like Theron herself, Lorraine is tough. Other than the occasional ice bath and some very basic first aid, she hardly ever stops to lick her many, many wounds. Should she be dead, or at the very least immobilized after some of the beatings she takes in this movie? Like, probably. But that's just the kind of story this is, and I will happily suspend my disbelief to watch her wail on all these dudes. I'm only kind of ashamed of the fact that I would let her kill me and enjoy it. I also really like how her injuries noticeably accumulate over the course of the film, and if you're like me, you speculate about which fights some of the memorably big bruises we saw at the beginning of the film were from, because by the end she is looking haggard as all hell. In a way that's actually pretty rare for female characters. Usually directors prioritize pretty over gritty. During the course of her mission, Lorraine meets Delphine LaSalle, played by Sophie Boutella, a young French intelligence agent who's in over her head as the climate in Berlin becomes more dangerous.
It's my first assignment with the French intelligence. I'm scared, okay? I got into this because it was exciting, but it's never been like this in Berlin.
LaSalle is hot in a very French way.
I look for pleasure in the details.
And there's a sense of goodness to her that I really like.
Sorry. You look like you needed saving.
They sleep together and we get a steamy sex scene, as well as some shots of them in bed cuddling.
So you made contact with the French operative?
Obviously.
There's a bit of an element of the male gaze to it for sure, but it also treats the romance the same way a Bond movie might treat the lead's relationship with a Bond girl, with intensity and sincerity. We're also introduced to Bremovich, a high-ranking KGB officer in charge of operations in East Berlin, played by Roland Muller.
But dedication and loyalty is very rare these days.
The cinematography and composition of this film is incredible, with nicely framed shots through doors and windows, and reflections in mirrors and on other surfaces that give us little hints that things aren't always what they seem. This movie is also an early example of the bi-lighting trend, with lots of purple, blue, and pink-lit scenes, particularly whenever Lorraine and Delphine are together. Throughout the film, Lorraine is mostly surrounded by monochrome, except for when she's with LaSalle, and the world is warm for a moment. The reds are pinker, the blues are brighter, Lorraine is softer. These scenes are juxtaposed with the harsh and overwhelmingly gray color palette of the rest of the film. Although, as a side note, I love these shots alongside the graffiti on the wall. Atomic Blonde shows us the grit and brutality of the conflict alongside the thrumming, irrepressible neon of the 1980s. One spy cliché that I think is used to wonderful effect in this movie is the use of listening devices. We get an extended shot early on in the film of Lorraine wearing a wire, and later listening to the recordings in her hotel. This pays off in a big way at the end of the movie. In The Coldest City, LaSalle is male and much less interesting. He isn't an inexperienced young spy in over his head, he's kind of just there. He still has a romance with Lorraine, but it's pretty flat and has very little impact. Which wasn't surprising given that was my overall impression of The Coldest City. The 2012 graphic novel by Anthony Johnston is more of a dialogue-based story with a lot less in the way of graphic violence. Which is fine, but it makes the story feel a lot less visceral and so much less tense. It has meandering pacing and a sketchy art style that isn't bad, but doesn't really pop where it feels like it should. One of the funnier differences between the film and the graphic novel is Lorraine isn't blonde in the book. It's hard to deny that Lorraine's less remarkable appearance in the graphic novel with her dark hair and sensible shoes isn't more realistic than film Lorraine's platinum bob and dangerous stilettos, since a spy's goal is generally to blend in, not stand out. But I am also so completely obsessed with her look in the film that I don't care. It's absolutely iconic. I do think it's an improvement. The graphic novel is entirely in black and white, and I think the choice to have most of the film in shades of bluish grays, as well as the lion's share of Lorraine's costuming primarily in similar monochromes, is likely a visual reference to the aesthetic of the graphic novel, and in both cases may represent the black and white, life-or-death world that spies operate in. In the graphic novel, there's also a subplot involving a network of loose cannon assassins for hire that Satchel is allegedly at the heart of. But they drop that storyline in the film, which helps to streamline the plot in a beneficial and more believable way, and allows us to focus on the important things in the film. Like Charlize Theron kicking ass. And also the gay. One thing I will give the graphic novel credit for is not pulling any punches with the ending the way the movie does. The Coldest City commits to a shocking twist and leaves us to sit with it, rather than trying to turn it on its head again to avoid making things too complicated or hard for the audience to swallow, which is ultimately the biggest weakness of the film. The ending is the best thing about the graphic novel, but the lead up to it just isn't as compelling as the movie. And not just because it's so blandly heterosexual. The story hits a lot of the same beats as the film, but without the lively fight choreography to carry the pacing. Despite its best efforts, it commits the grave sin of being boring, which is not what you want for a spy story. Excitement is sort of a hallmark of the genre, and unfortunately it's lacking in The Coldest City. Now I want to talk a little bit more about some of the choices Atomic Blonde made in adaptation. And this is where we're going to get deep into the spoiler territory, so consider this your warning. As the film goes on, holes start appearing in Percival's story.
We have to deal with Spyglass. He's hardly the most trustworthy I've ever met, or the fucking brightest.
Wait, you said you hadn't met him.
And he reveals to Lorraine that they don't need the list after all, because they have Spyglass in his eidetic memory.
I lied, and he claims to have memorized the entire list.
A fact he's concealed from her up to this point.
Had I known earlier, I would have prioritized Spyglass.
So they hatch a plan to smuggle him out during a demonstration against the Berlin Wall. We also know that Percival got the list from Bacton after ice-picking him right in the face. He then tries to strike a deal with the Russians to give them information that will keep the balance in Berlin.
At times like this, Berlin has its own set of rules.
I can give you information that will keep the balance.
But he refuses to give them the list. LaSalle takes photos of the meeting and tells Lorraine what she saw during one of their cuddle sessions. Lorraine tries to tell LaSalle that the relationships spies form aren't real.
Percival's trying to set me up. Are you surprised? Not really. These relationships aren't real.
But LaSalle sees right through her.
You tell the truth, you look different. Your eyes change.
It's a nice moment with just the smallest hint of vulnerability from Lorraine. Now that Lorraine is suspicious of Percival, she puts some safeguards in place to ensure that the plan runs smoothly. But it's not enough to keep Percival from shooting Spyglass. He survives, and Lorraine manages to escort him through a number of dangerous firefights, giving us some of the best throwdowns in the film, until Spyglass meets his end in a car chase that results in their vehicle crashing into the Spree. It's legitimately sad, especially since we met his wife and child, who Percival surprised Lorraine with to further complicate the plan.
It's his family.
This was not part of the plan.
Part of mine.
They make it across without him. And Lorraine realizes she really has been made, and not just by the KGB. It's worth noting that the first time the KGB sincerely tried to kill her was here, after the meeting Percival had with Bremovich. After getting back to the West, she goes on a hunt for listening devices in her hotel room, and finds a French device Percival planted to frame LaSalle. Unfortunately, she also informs LaSalle that Percival tried to set them up.
He set us both up. You have to leave while you can.
And tells her to leave Berlin.
Don't underestimate me, Percival.
LaSalle, listen to me very carefully. You have no idea who you're dealing with.
But instead, LaSalle responds by foolishly threatening Percival, which immediately gets her killed. And I hate it. I hate it for a couple reasons. First, although it might not be the most egregious example because it is a spy movie with a high body count, I would still consider this a bury your gays moment. Killing LaSalle really wasn't necessary for the plot, and just gave Lorraine an additional reason to go after Percival when she already had a compelling one, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. Second, I hate the framing of the scene. I hate the little bodysuit LaSalle wears, and the male gaziness of the way the struggle and her body are shot. I don't like that Percival strangles her. It just feels weirdly eroticized. And I hate the way Lorraine walks in just moments too late. I understand why they made the choice they did with that plot point, but I would also have liked the story so much more if they hadn't. Also, it's a nitpick, but it bugs me that Lorraine doesn't even try CPR. Even if it might have been futile, it's not like LaSalle was shot. Give it a go. The Bond girl dying is a trope I simply could have done without in this bisexual twist on the classic formula. I do think at the very least the bury your gaze optics on the part of the writers was unintentional, as LaSalle does die in the graphic novel as well. But if they could change LaSalle's gender, it stands to reason that they could have also changed her fate. And it'd be more interesting to have them part ways with LaSalle alive, especially with the sequel in the works. She would have made a great loose end, but for being Casino Royale. It's a frustrating cliche that feels like it belongs in a much worse film. But that's not the only place Atomic Blonde stumbles. Framed against the wall coming down and the border between East and West opening, Lorraine is out for blood and hunts down Percival as a mournful cover of 99 Luftballons plays in the background. And the scene where she shoots him is just...
I fucking love Berlin!
So good. Percival had perused the list while it was in his possession and figured out the identity of Satchel.
Oh, I'm very close to Satchel.
As he's bleeding out on the ground, Lorraine confronts him.
Isn't that right, Comrade Satchel? It's a double pleasure to deceive the deceiver.
Including rightly pointing out that LaSalle didn't have to die.
You didn't have to kill her.
And retrieves the list before she takes out the trash. And she tells the stunned CIA and MI6 agents her version of what happened.
I uncovered your traitor, Satchel. Brought him the only justice he deserved.
This is also a departure from the graphic novel, where she denies her involvement in his death completely. Just don't know what happened to him, aw geez. Percival is also just way less entertaining in the book. He's just kind of a garden variety misogynist. She presents them with Delphine's photos of Percival's meeting with Bremovich, and an incriminating tape which she's spliced together from several of the conversations we witnessed throughout the film.
We have a deal? What about the British?
And it seems like the list has gone missing again. Aw shucks.
Where's the list? Where's the list, Lorraine?
I don't know.
MI6 decides to just bury the whole thing on account of how very bad it makes them all look.
We're choosing to bury this one. Your mission never took place. This conversation never happened.
And Lorraine asks,
What should I wear for my tea with the Queen?
And we cut to 3 days later, where a brunette Lorraine wearing communist red strides into a meeting with Bremovich in Paris, where he greets her as...
Tavares, Satchel.
And the jaws hit the floor. This is where the graphic novel ends, with the reveal that Lorraine was the double agent all along. Side note, in the novel she wears a blonde wig to travel incognito to this meeting, so it's kind of fun that the film inverts it by having her don a brunette wig to hide her blonde hair in this scene in the film. This reveal beautifully recontextualizes the entire film. From the very first scene where James says,
Satchel gave me up.
To this line that initially seemed to implicate Percival.
Oh, I'm very close to Satchel.
Our red herring in the whole operation. When you go back and watch the film a second time, the clues are all over the place. They're practically slapping you in the face with it.
Satchel has been compromised.
But like Lorraine, they also successfully misdirected us. Looking back, we realize why she was so aggressive with LaSalle during one of their first encounters.
I know who you are. You're Lorraine Broughton, and you're here because of the death of Gascoigne.
Because she thought she knew something about Satchel.
What do you know about Gascoigne?
Nothing.
Despite her many interactions with the KGB agents, they seemed, at least at first, to not be trying to kill her.
Is this your first time in Berlin?
Yes.
Well, it's a remarkable time to be here.
Their reactions to her attacks were almost baffled when you actually pay attention to them, and they keep trying to talk her out of fighting them. The color red also seems relevant, as it appears throughout the film. We see it in Lorraine's stilettos when she first fights the Russians in the car. We see it in the lighting at the restaurant where she initially bumps into Bremovich, before the tone becomes more pink when LaSalle appears. And we see it once more in the red jacket she wears when she meets with the Soviets in Paris at the end of the film. It's a great ending and makes Lorraine even more interesting. Unfortunately, the film goes on for a few minutes longer as Lorraine hands the list over to the Russians, and they attempt to torture her. Because of course they found out from Percival that she wasn't working for them after all. Lorraine pulls a gun from an ice bucket and quickly makes the Russians into Rushnauts.
I never worked for you. Every false intel I gave you, a rip in the Iron Curtain. Every piece of intel you gave me, a bullet in my fucking gun.
Before strutting out of there to Under Pressure. And then she boards a plane where John Goodman, the CIA guy, is waiting for her. Of course revealing that she was actually a triple agent working for America all along. And honestly, I think the ending in the graphic novel was so much meatier in terms of the implications. Like, yes, the US, Russia, and the UK are all evil colonizing empires with varying fascist tendencies. But for general audiences, having her work as a double agent for Cold War-era Russia is a more morally challenging ending than having her work for the US, and would have potentially added some complexity by forcing us to speculate about her reasoning and origins. Having her work for the CIA feels like a bit of a cop-out, so the audiences don't have to deal with the implications of the protagonist we've been watching all along actually being a double agent. This ending does offer some interesting themes about the US sabotaging the UK's influence in post-war Germany, but they're not really explored in any meaningful way throughout the film, and so fall flat as a complicating theme for both the character and the story. We also don't really sit with the fact that she turned over James to the KGB, and the film ultimately ends up with an anti-communist, rah rah America message that makes it a lot less original and distinct as spy movies go. That said, it's a clever film with a lot of little details that stand out on rewatch. Like the way the soundtrack is often synced perfectly to give us little hints to the story, like this Flock of Seagulls song during the feudal car chase.
Fasten your seatbelt.
And Andy is going to tell us a little bit more about another great detail, Atomic Blonde's use of posters and a scene from the 1979 movie Stalker.
Now, something in movies that always kind of tickles my brain in a funny way is when you see characters watching another movie or there's a TV playing something in the background, because those choices are never random, and it especially tickles me when it has a direct meaning or direct line to the actual storytelling or the setting of the film you're watching. Now, I truly love movies with all my heart and all my soul, and at the risk of sounding pretentious now, one film that truly just to me makes full use of the cinematic language as real, tangible, visual poetry is the best way I can describe it, is a film called Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky. And if you don't know it, I'll make it very, very short. It's basically a trio going on an expedition into the mysterious zone where the nature around them seems very much alive and trying to kill them if they set one foot wrong. But at the center of this zone is a magical room that can basically make your deepest desires come true if you wish it. And I think that film is just hypnotizing. And so when I first watched Atomic Blonde and Lorraine enters a movie theater and in it are posters for Tarkovsky's Stalker, and then she proceeds to have a full-on fight scene in front of a silver screen on which the film is projected, I was just overcome with joy. And not only because the entire fight scene takes place during one shot of Stalker, and I remember watching Stalker for the first time and being like, this shot takes forever and it just keeps going and keeps going and then keeps going. And so I thought it was such a fun gag to have an entire fight scene just play out throughout one shot of that other film. But it also has a relevance to the setting of the film. You really can't ignore watching this that Stalker very much is a Russian film and very much considered a Soviet picture. Yet its director often got in trouble for having some opinions, and some things were expressed throughout his filmography that weren't interpreted necessarily as Soviet-leaning. Yet the complication comes in then when actually the Soviet Union wanted great pieces of art to come out of their nation, and Tarkovsky was a very well-respected director. And so I think in the end he got a lot of things his way. And I think it's interesting that then in this film, Atomic Blonde, which is about the conflict between the East and the West, you have featured in it something that in itself is kind of a east-west paradox of a film. I read a review once by a critic named Simon Abrams, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but he said that Berlin in this film is basically like the zone in Stalker. It's like this Wild West type place where everything around you can and will kill you. And I think that's such a cool reading because, like, you have this city, Berlin, which is just drenched in generational trauma and pain and conflict from so many corners in history, and you take it and elevate it to this heightened, stylized place where every nation in the world are flocking there to find something of great value, their deepest desires. And they're fighting themselves and each other to kind of get there first. All of that just makes this film so much more interesting to me, to be honest.
During editing, I also noticed one of the other posters in the theater scene that I hadn't actually looked at closely enough, even on multiple watches of the film. It's the theatrical poster for Coming Out, which was, according to Wikipedia, the last film in East Germany released by DEFA, the state-owned movie studio. It was directed by Heiner Caro and starred Matthias Freihoff. It was the first openly gay movie released by the studio, and it did actually premiere there in November 1989 when the film takes place. It's a nice little Easter egg that easily flies under the radar in a film with so much going on. There are just so many little things that add texture and fun to this movie. Paying close attention to the set design offers all sorts of delightful little snapshots into the characters and story, and it helps make up for the weaker elements of the film. When it's good, it's really good. Overall, I like Atomic Blonde a lot, despite its flaws. The kinetic action sequences and 80s bops really liven up the film and inject fun and tension into an otherwise grim story. It's one of those movies that rewards rewatching with new details you pick up on every subsequent viewing. The setup and payoff in this film is really well done, and there are so many little clues that could enable first-time viewers to figure out who Satchel is, if they pay close enough attention. I didn't. But Lorraine is a masterfully done, unreliable narrator, where even as we watch the film from her perspective, we're kept in the dark until either the truth is revealed, or we've put the pieces together ourselves. Like the film tells us from the start,
Trust no one.
Atomic Blonde definitely has problems, and I think it would be a much more impactful film if it had just stuck to the ending in the graphic novel, but I'm still glad a queer spy movie like this exists, and I can't wait to see what the sequel has to offer. Hopefully more gays that they keep alive. But that's just my opinion. What did you think of Atomic Blonde? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd also like to thank Andy Villin for his contributions to this video.
Thank you so much for that, Ren, and to all of you, thank you so much for watching. I mean, I think I speak for us both when I say this was our first collab, a very interesting experience. So much is going on behind the scenes, and it's been a lot of fun, so I'm so happy I could be a part of it. Thank you.
Please remember to give him some love and check out his review of the film as well, link in the description. Thanks for watching, like, share, and subscribe for more videos. See you next time, Wiedersehen.